as well kick off. So thank you everyone for joining us at today's ISESA webinar. I'm Sarah Jane. I am Vice Chair of ISESA, and I am delighted to welcome Josh Frost here to speak with us today. So Josh is a PhD researcher over in the University of Melbourne, and he's affiliated with the Elite Sports and Mental Health team at Orygen as well. So the team there, they do research with athletes, coaches, and high performance staff, really trying to find better ways to support all those working in the high performance sporting environments. And I suppose with the busy time coming up to the summer ahead and all the events and competitions and games coming up, we decided it was a really good topic to address, and heard of Josh, and we reached out to him, and straight away he agreed to come on to our webinar. So we really are grateful. I know it's 9 p.m. I think you said there in Australia. So we're all in the middle of the day eating our lunch here. So thank you for giving us the time. I'll pass it over to you, Josh, but firstly, thank you all for joining us for this webinar as well. If you have any questions, would you pop them into the Q&A section there? And at the end of the webinar, I'll be able to feed them to Josh. And yeah, so pop all questions you have in there. And Josh, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah Jane. Let me just get my slides set up and we can get going. Can you see those slides all right?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks, Sarah Jane. I really appreciate you taking the time to introduce me. I thought I'd start off by saying Gia Eve to everybody. My Irish partner and I have been trying to practice ways to welcome the presentation and stuff like that. So yeah, I hope everyone's going well and enjoying their day so far. As I said, I'm located over here in Australia. My name's Josh. I'm obviously a PhD researcher at the University of Melbourne. I'm about just under 3 years through my candidature so far, and I'm really excited today to talk about some of the research that I've been exploring, looking at the mental health of elite sports coaches, and trying to target and address some of the aspects of the elite sports staffers too. So yeah, I like I said, or as Sarah Jane alluded to, I'm part of the organisation called Orygen in Melbourne too. I work as part of the elite sports and mental health team. And as Sarah Jane was talking about, we look at a lot of athletes, coaches and support staff to find ways to better support their mental health, to try identifying solutions and strategies to be able to understand the way that they experience and perceive mental health so we can improve their mental health outcomes and things like that. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about that in some of my research, what we've been able to find, and try to talk about some of the strategies that we think can be utilized from I suppose, an individual perspective and an organizational perspective to support these communities and populations. So yeah, looking forward to sharing some of my passion projects and some of the studies that I've been undertaking kind of so far throughout my candidature. So I suppose to begin off with, I wanted to talk a little bit about coaches and how over, I suppose, the past decade or so, there's been a growing number of, I say, anecdotal stories and media reports around the mental health challenges that elite coaches face and encounter. And I suppose given the expansion of research into the mental health of elite athletes, it's really important that these individuals are not forgotten from that conversation, including support staff too. Given the sort of demands that they encounter, whether that be having to, I suppose, hit and achieve certain performance outcomes, the large amounts of travel that these sorts of individuals have to go through, like their elite athletes, and also the long working hours that can often be put in place to have to accomplish and achieve some of the goals that have been set out by them and things like that. So it's really important that we start creating a conversation around coaches and not just focusing on the mental health of elite athletes in this space. I think there's potentially even an argument to suggest that coaches may be even more susceptible to mental health challenges than elite athletes. Some of the stresses and challenges they might face include, having to deal with executives and boards, potentially having to act as the public face of a sporting organization, having to perhaps manage a myriad of different staff members and athletes. And often the coaching role can be met with kind of job insecurity, very low contracts or short-term contracts and things like that. So there's a lot of moving parts that make the profession very challenging, that can put a lot of pressure on them. So I think with these, I suppose, growing first-hand accounts, there's probably an urgent need to start understanding how these individuals experience mental health, to to put supports in place to, I suppose, protect the psychological well-being of these individuals. Now, I think it's also important to think of other members that are kind of looking after and being able to support athletes, and the support staff or the entourage or whatever you want to best call them also need to be considered and looked at with regards to their mental health. So I suppose when I'm talking about the support staff or entourage, these might be physiotherapists, strength and conditioning coaches, nutritionists, sports psychologists, player development managers, any sorts of member behind the kind of scene that are supporting athletes or trying to find ways to improve their psychological, physiological kind of shape or health outcomes and things like that. There's not a lot of research in this space, and there needs to be a little bit more attention directed towards these individuals, given that they actually also experience challenges associated with working within, I suppose, high performance environments. Now, to contextualize high performance environments in general, I suppose we like to utilize here at Orygen kind of ecosystems or ecological systems to look at and I suppose investigate and explore the relationship between aspects or experiences of an individual, say an athlete, and some of the kind of broader socio-cultural context. So, you know, how does their support network, how does their interpersonal relationships, whether they be coaches, parents, how do they influence the mental health of elite athletes, for example? How does an individual support and some of the organizations that an athlete might work for example, how do they increase or worsen the mental health of an athlete? And how can broader, more kind of macro system-based factors influence the mental health of an athlete? You think about media scrutiny, working in the public, sporting environments and things like that. They all have a sort of influence upon the mental health outcomes and experiences of an athlete. So we use these sort of ecological systems theories, which can often go back to the sorts of works of Bronfenbrenner and his kind of development of the ecological systems theory model, so that we're not, I suppose, potentially pathologizing the individual for their presentation of symptoms, for example, the experiences that they're going through. So yeah, today I want to be talking about the elite sports ecosystem. I'm going to be talking about factors influencing the mental health outcomes of coaches, and support staff using this framework. When looking at coaches and support staff specifically, we usually find them here in this kind of little microsystem in their type of ability to influence the mental health outcomes of athletes. But today, as I kind of talked about, we want to be looking at coaches and support staff as those individuals. How do their support network influence their mental health? Are they socially isolated? Are they in and amongst robust social networks with coaches, with family, with friends and things like that? So we're going to be looking at that in a little bit, utilizing this kind of conceptualization. So talking about a little bit of the research, what do we know about the mental health of high performance coaches and support staff? Well, to start off with, I want to talk about some of the demands and challenges that these sorts of individuals encounter. And when we look at, I suppose, demands, or if you want to perceive them as stresses, we often categorize them into three different groups. We can look at performance-based stresses that influence the mental health of coaches or support staff. So we can think of things like how do poor performance outcomes contribute towards burnout and stress in coaches? How do poor training or substandard training sessions contribute towards the mental health of coaches? And what about things such as inadequate time to prepare for competition, that sort of competition preparation? We can also think about more systemic kind of organizational challenges, which often tend to have the most influence, I suppose, on the mental health outcomes of coaches and support staff. If we think about job security, you know, media scrutiny, having to work long working hours, not having sufficient resources to be able to execute the sorts of training sessions or perhaps achieve some of the performance goals that are required. These sorts of stresses can put a great toll on the mental health of coaches and support staff. So these are something to consider, as organizations play quite a significant role in supporting the mental health of this community. And then finally, like everyone within a working position, personal stresses. So how do relationship issues, social isolation, poor work-life balance, how do they all contribute towards an individual perhaps feeling more vulnerable to mental health, not being around their sorts of support network, having damage or challenges with relationships from having to work long hours, from having to travel and things like that, not having the time to work on professional development or work on hobbies or relationships and things like that. There are often personal stresses associated with these communities too. So I want to touch on a little bit about my research, which is initially kind of directed at the mental health of elite coaches and does have some relevancy for sports staff to start off with. But earlier this year, I had a systematic scoping review published, examining the evidence base and the discourse to understand what do we know about the mental health of elite level coaches. So we utilized a framework developed by Corey Keyes, which kind of looks at mental health through two continua, looking at proponents of well-being, but also looking at symptoms of mental health and mental disorders, for example. So we were looking at what does the evidence tell us about the mental health of elite coaches? And then also, what are the sorts of factors that contribute towards mental health outcomes in and amongst elite coaches? We applied that kind of socio-ecological model that I kind of just showed you previously to apply and try understand the factors that influence the mental health of coaches. So we started to look a little bit at that behind the research. And then finally, we wanted to look at this relationship between mental health and coaching effectiveness. So how does perhaps a coach's mental health influence their ability to coach effectively, whether that be their own ability to function with their ability to communicate, what is their leadership style looks like, what is their motivation, their body language, for example. But how does it also contribute towards an athlete's functioning, their ability to feel confident, their ability to, I suppose, take on information that's presented towards them, and things like that. So I'm not going to talk about this too much, but there was some evidence to suggest that an individual's or a coach's mental health may impact their effectiveness. This is very much a growing area, and there needs to be a lot more research in this space. But there is a little bit of a relationship there, which is really interesting, I think, because this could potentially be utilized as a hook to engage coaches and organizations in prioritizing and wanting to ensure that coaches feel that mental health is important. If we can suggest that their mental health can influence their performance or their effectiveness, then this might be something that is prioritized and can be implemented within policy and prioritized a bit more. So I'm going to run through a bit of the findings that we were able to generate from the research. I want to talk about the prevalence of mental health symptoms first. And you might be able to see there's a range of symptoms associated with depression, anxiety, burnout, alcohol consumption that were found. But the rates are very inconsistent at this stage. We don't have a lot of research being able to demonstrate and indicate the proportion of coaches that might be experiencing mental health symptoms. So that makes it very challenging to know what is the true proportion of coaches who might be susceptible to mental health. How can we compare that to elite athletes or the general community? So there needs to be more research in this area. It ranges from 3 to 2 studies investigating prevalence rates of mental health in elite coaches. You can see that rates, like for depression, for example, range from 14% of a sample or a population to 44% of a population, or the sample kind of looked at that were experiencing depressive symptoms. You might look at risky alcohol consumption too, for example, 19% to 48%. So there needs to be more research done here so we can actually gauge genuine kind of rates to be able to investigate this population. A couple other things to note with regards to this is the use of varying psychometric instruments. So going forward, I think as researchers, we need to utilize consistent measures so that we can have more validated, when we look at rates, they're more validated and credible, and they can utilize better cross comparison. And I think sample sizes is something that's a huge challenge in and amongst this kind of field. Trying to recruit high performance coaches, trying to get sufficient sample sizes is a really challenging thing because their population is a lot smaller than the athlete population. So this is something that I suppose needs to be focused on, given that, rates of mental health symptoms can, with some of these statistics can be as low as, 69 coaches or 78 coaches. They're very small amounts of populations. So this needs to be something that can be focused on. So what were the risk factors that we found? So applying this kind of socio-ecological lens again, we were able to identify a number of different factors influencing the mental health of elite coaches. From an individual's perspective, with the proliferation of demands and stresses, which when I suppose accompanied with ineffective coping strategies or maladaptive coping strategies, such as an over-reliance on alcohol, this can contribute towards poor mental health outcomes in and amongst elite coaches. You think about sometimes coaches with with less experience or being older, for example, might be more susceptible to things such as burnout and might not having the energy to be able to cope with the stresses and demands of the profession, or perhaps not having the experience to know when to stop or when to leave the office, for example. You think about leadership styles, those coaches who might be more inclined to have a more controlling style were found to have or found to be more likely to experience symptoms of burnout. And then we also think of the type of motivation an individual has. So if coaches with more externally based motivations, whether it be the want or desire to achieve certain performance outcomes or being expected by an organization or a hierarchy to be able to achieve some form of performance outcome, that was more likely to lead to burnout in a coach compared to others. When looking at this interpersonal kind of microsystem, social support is a massive influence upon the mental health of elite coaches and support staff. Those who are more isolated, those who had smaller social support networks were more likely to experience mental health compared to those who had more robust social support networks. So this is potentially a modifiable sort of trait in an area for intervention. So social support is something that's a key area, I think, that we can work on going forward to support these individuals. Looking at organizational factors, excessive workloads, not having, I suppose, enough physiological or psychological recovery time to be able to deal with the demands and stresses can really contribute towards feelings of burnout. You think about poor work-life balance, which, when you chuck in job insecurity there as well, can be really, really challenging for coaches to deal with. So yeah, it's a very challenging thing that needs to be considered. And then finally, when we're looking at, I suppose, societal factors, I think it's important to consider how things such as stigma towards help seeking, hypermasculine cultures that perhaps promote and glorify values like stoicism or mental toughness, how they might contribute towards an individual or a coach less likely to go seek mental health support. So societal factors also play a role in supporting the mental health of coaches. Looking at those protective factors, so flipping it on the other side, having higher levels of emotional intelligence, robust psychological skills, self-compassion, resilience, those sorts of things can help an individual feel more protected against mental health. Another interesting one, I think, is identities. Having external identities beyond being a coach, I think, is really important to help provide that distance between some of the performance or results that might influence a person's mood. For example, if an individual perhaps also has a strong affiliation with being a dad or a mum or a friend or a daughter or a son, those sorts of things can help a coach, I suppose, detach from some of the challenging things that there might be when they're experiencing poor results. So we found strong coaching or non-coaching identities to be important. I've talked about the interpersonal networks and the importance of robust ones, and then the ideas of organizations and their influence. They have a real, like I said, important role in protecting the mental health of elite coaches. So we need to find practical and engaging ways to create organizational support, whether it be resources, tailored pathways to help seeking, which we're going to touch on a little bit later, and other sorts of factors. So what I want to do now is kind of streamline this or take this into the idea of elite coaches and entourage. So integrate some of the research put together that we found in this space. So a little bit earlier this year, my colleagues and I published a kind of review of the academic literature exploring the mental health of elite coaches and the elite sports entourage. And within the review, we found, or we discussed an empirical study that was conducted by some of the researchers at Orygen, looking at both the mental health of elite coaches and the entourage, specifically looking at the prevalence and correlates of mental health symptoms in and amongst Australian coaches and high-performance support staff to discern whether there might be differences or similarities between rates and correlates of mental health symptoms in these two communities. So what do we find? We found that rates of mental health symptoms were consistent between coaches and high performance support staff. So there were no statistically significant differences between the two communities and populations, which is an interesting finding. You can see, obviously, rates can be as high when we're looking at some symptoms of anxiety and depression, for example. 43.6% of the coaching population were experiencing probable caseness of symptoms of anxiety, depression that warrant, I suppose, psychological support or help, compared to 14.1% of the entourage. Other high rates, you can see risky alcohol consumption, which is really interesting, and something that when we compared the research or the findings against published athlete samples from the same sort of studying group and things like that, we found that there was a statistically significant difference between the proportion of coaches and entourage engaging in risky alcohol consumption compared to the athletes. So you probably wouldn't, this is probably not something too surprising, given that athletes might be people who are more cognizant, I suppose, of their physiology, their body shape, their weight, in order to enhance their performance outcomes. But it might also demonstrate an inkling that coaches and entourage might utilize these as coping strategies to be able to look after their mental health and things like that. So showing that nearly 1 in 2 coaches met the criteria for risky alcohol consumption is really interesting and warrants kind of further research in this space. When looking at the data, I think, another thing to be cognizant of are sample sizes. As I've talked about, again, only 78 coaches were investigated in this online survey. Is that a generalizable population or sample of the Australian elite coaches? Probably not. So, how accurate or how credible is this data? And it really kind of brings or sheds light and more attention on the need for getting those higher sample sizes so we can generalize the results a little bit more to the broader population of coaches. Some of the correlates of mental health symptoms worth touching on, or we found that was statistically significant. Satisfaction with life balance. Those who had lower levels of satisfaction with life balance were more likely to have higher or elevated rates of risky alcohol consumption and psychological distress. Similar with satisfaction with social support. So those who had low levels of social support or perceived social support had worse sleep disturbance and psychological distress. And then also, if you think about age as well, so how demographics might influence the prevalence of mental health symptoms. So those coaches and support staff who tended to be younger were more likely to have elevated levels of psychological distress. So a few things to take into consideration, especially because I think when we're looking at the first 2 ones, we think of life balance and social support. These are kind of potential modifiable factors, I would say. And organizations and coaches and support staff can play a role in actually improving life balance, improving their kind of robust support networks and things like that. So these are areas that can actually be investigated a bit more within organizations or within coaches and support staff themselves to improve and enhance their overall kind of mental health outcomes. So I think that's a really interesting thing and something that I'm going to be touching on a little bit later about ways to support these individuals. One of the other findings that was quite interesting to see was that there were no significant gender differences from the data. So whether that's representative in different countries or across different populations, if you split down, the coaches, if you split down the support staff to be able to examine the differences between sex and gender, that might be something a little bit interesting. But yeah, I thought that was something that kind of popped out, that there was no difference between sex and gender or different sport types. So whether you're a coach or support staff was involved in a team sport or an individual sport, there was no statistical influence upon all the mental health outcomes that were present there. So what do we kind of do now? What are the things that I suppose that can be done to be able to support these individuals? Now I've gone through a little bit of the research and what we know about the mental health of elite coaches and some of the one empirical study looking at the mental health of coaches and support staff. I think it was last year, we put together a bit of an opinion paper, my research team and I, looking at ways that we can support the mental health specifically of elite coaches, but that might be or would probably be applicable in the context of support staff too. So what sort of things can we do to support these communities and populations? And the focus of this paper and this article was to try create ideas or create strategies that could be utilized for early intervention. So as I mentioned, the organization that I work for, Orygen, a lot of our philosophical underpinnings is trying to find ways that when symptoms start to present or they start to emerge, how can we find ways to strategically support them so that symptoms aren't getting more severe, or that initial symptoms aren't, I suppose, emerging into more persistent mental health conditions or disorders. So early intervention is a very fundamental kind of strategy that we try to look at Orygen, and that some of our work in the elite sports and mental health team tries to focus on to be able to support these individuals. So we came up with kind of 4 broad recommendations that I'm going to be talking about that could be utilized to potentially support the mental health of elite coaches and support staff too. So a lot of these strategies aren't, I suppose, groundbreaking or new. They've been utilized or put forward in other sorts of frameworks to be able to support the mental health of elite athletes. And we just wanted to take a little bit more of a tailored approach for coaches rather than just dumping the same thing that's being utilized for athletes onto coaches. So having that more curated and tailored and nuanced approach to be able to support these individuals. So these sorts of intervention strategies to take into consideration are, I suppose, more based on what the organization and the ecosystem can do to be able to support the mental health of coaches and support staff. I think, there is research indicating from an individual perspective that elite coaches can utilize things such as mindfulness-based practices or engage in scheduled regular physical activity, or building those support networks are really important. But organizations have such a big influence and role in setting the kind of demands and setting the role expectation, the amount of time that's required of coaches to be able to complete the tasks that are required. What are their help-seeking pathways, for example? So organizations play a really fundamental structural role in being able to intervene early and curate these kind of environments that are conducive to supporting the mental health of coaches and support staff. So our first recommendation was looking at mental health screening. So those of you who are aware of the SMAT, or the Sport Mental Health Assessment tool, that's been, I suppose, standardized and developed by the International Olympic Committee. There are no specific coach-based psychometric instruments to measure, I suppose, coach-specific stressors or mental health symptoms or outcomes in elite coaches. So our recommendation was utilizing some of the psychometric instruments utilized or put forward in the SMAT to be able to measure symptoms of anxiety, risky alcohol consumption, eating disorders, depression in and amongst elite coaches, to be able to screen for mental health symptoms in coaches so that we can catch those symptoms early and put the supports in place to be able to deal and manage with some of the challenges that coaches or support staff might be dealing with. Mental health literacy, education, providing coaches with the insights, knowledge, the beliefs, attitudes that might be able to support their mental health and might be able to direct them if they see symptoms arising. Do they know where coaches might go if they were experiencing psychological distress and they wanted to go seek counselling or some sort of mental health support? What sort of things can be done there? So enhancing mental health literacy and ensuring coaches have a foundational or baseline level of mental health literacy is really important. Obviously, I think at this stage, research is, there's a real kind of paucity of research around this topic. So using things such as the mental health literacy survey might be a good way to be able to examine the mental health literacy of coaches going forward. So that was the proposal that we kind of make, given this is a validated tool. Psychological safety, another important one that's very common in and amongst high performance environments, but how do we cultivate elite sports environments that allow coaches and support staff to take interpersonal risks, to be vulnerable, to be able to talk about mental health without having the consequences that they're going to lose their job or have to sit on the sideline or whatever it might be and things like that. So how can we cultivate these high performance environments? How can the hierarchy, how can the board, how can even the head coach, for example, and their influence on other assistant coaches or other support staff, how does their environment, how can we cultivate a psychologically safe environment that supports their mental health and well-being? So one of the ways that we can assess this at this stage is using the something called the sports psychological safety inventory. So this is a measure that was developed by one of the members on our research team to be able to investigate levels of psychological safety within high performance environments. So this tool has actually been validated with coaches and support staff previously. So it can be something that, if you're curious about knowing how, how likely an individual is to go seek mental health support, or what sort of stigma do they feel about talking about mental health support and things like that, that tool can be utilized, or that screening measure can be utilized to be able to assess some of those things. And then finally, I suppose the pot of gold of all the things or the strategies that we think might be worth supporting is curating targeted and, I suppose, nuanced sort of pathways to mental health support. So how can we find out relevant and engaging pathways that coaches and support staff can use if they feel like they need to access psychological supports and services? So what does that pathway look like? Who is it with, for example? Is it an external professional, an internal professional as part of the organization? How does that look like? Does it want to be discreet? Do we want to do it online? How much does it cost? Does it want to be as part of the organization, or would a coach prefer to receive sort of that sort of information externally? So there's lots of things that should be considered there, I think, with regards to mental health supports and how we can curate ways and cultivate ways that are actually relevant and engaging for coaches, so they feel that they can access those supports and there's not stigma attached to seeking psychological support if needed. So that's a little bit about what's kind of been happening within the research. But where do we go from here? What are the next phases that are kind of best to address to support the mental health of coaches and support staff? And how can you be involved if this is something that you're interested in? So I'm conducting a number of different studies at the moment that might be of interest with regards to the mental health of high performance coaches and support staff. My first study is looking at, as I've talked about, mental health literacy. So the kind of studies that I'm investigating and kind of building upon the research and evidence base utilized within that I kind of discussed in the supporting the mental health of elite coaches paper. And we want to figure out a little bit more about the mental health of elite coaches. So, and their kind of perceptions and attitudes towards mental health. So we have an online survey that we're currently conducting, asking questions about demographics. We're looking at coaching backgrounds, risk factors. So how does job insecurity, how does long working hours contribute towards potentially mental health symptoms and outcomes in elite coaches? And we're also looking at those perceptions and attitudes towards the mental health, or perceptions and actually attitudes towards mental health in and amongst elite coaches. So thinking about, can they identify symptoms? Would a coach know where to seek mental health support? How do they feel about certain different treatments and the efficacy of those treatments, and whether there might be stigma kind of emerging? So this is a research project that we're undertaking with elite coaches worldwide. So we're looking at Olympic, Paralympic coaches, those who are involved with national, international, or even professional competitions. So there's a whole range of things kind of put forward there. We have around, I think, 130, 140 coaches at present who have completed the survey. So we're looking to, get some really useful and important insights into how coaches perceive mental health in and amongst the high performance community. One of the other kind of studies that I'm looking at is talking about mental health seeking. This is a really cool project that I'm undertaking that is funded by the International Olympic Committee. So the International Olympic Committee are quite interested in finding out how Olympic and Paralympic coaches want to seek mental health support. What are the things that make it challenging, or what are the barriers to seeking mental health support for these individuals? So we have a bit of we have a research project put here where we're utilizing something called a concept mapping methodology, which is basically kind of like an online focus group where we present we present the question put forward there, what makes it challenging for an Olympic or Paralympic coach to seek help for their mental health. And then participants and respondents are able to generate and curate responses in regards to this kind of prompt put forward there. So any sorts of ideas and statements that are kind of interesting or feel relevant to that question, they can kind of respond to. So people who might be eligible to participate in this project might include former and current Olympic, Paralympic coaches, but also medical professionals who work directly with Olympic or Paralympic coaches in providing mental health services or support, or even facilitate referrals to mental health services. So you might be an athletic trainer, you might be a sports psychologist. And we wanted to utilize this because I thought it was really interesting to not only get the insights from coaches, but also the people who manage or look after or refer those coaches. What are those sorts of barriers that are kind of put in place that might be challenging? So we've got two sorts of angles there that might be able to really kind of put together this really sort of interesting set of insights that hopefully can be utilized to develop tailored pathways to support for coaches that are engaging and relevant. So the study takes about 20 to 30 minutes to complete. We're actually in the final phase of data collection. So you're welcome to sign up using the QR code. Each of the participants who, if you do consider signing up, you'll get a €30 voucher. So it's pretty crazy work for 20, 30 minutes, hopefully. And we're actually collecting data at the moment. So you're welcome to be involved with it if it's something that's interesting. As I said, the QR codes are presented there. So to sum it all up, what are the outcomes and significance of this research? What are the things that we want to do going forward? I think it's really important that we start to develop a better understanding and put more resources, research and time into gauging how elite coaches and support staff experience mental health, given that they're part of these high performance and highly pressurized environments. So what are the sorts of things that we know that might make a coach or support staff more susceptible to experiencing mental health? What sort of things can we put in place to better support these individuals? We also want to look at, or I feel like there needs to be a greater need towards looking at the prevalence of symptoms in elite coaches, so proponents of mental health, as well as support staff too. We really, at this stage, don't know how susceptible coaches are to mental health and how or whether we can compare this to the general community or the athletic population. Might these communities be, given the highly pressurized environments that they're within, might they be more susceptible to mental health compared to some of the other communities that are kind of just listed off there? And what sort of conditions or disorders might, for example, be more prominent and prolific within this population? And then finally, I think all this research is coming together to start generating those insights that can be utilized to develop a potential mental health framework for coaches and the entourage. As I said, the ISE have already created and put things in place for their elite athletes, but there's no such thing yet for coaches and support staff. So this research and hopefully the growing research within the field will help contribute towards these sorts of outcomes so that we can generate a mental health framework, whether it be internationally or nationally, to be able to support our coaches so that these individuals don't feel like they have to depart the profession and go to other sorts of industries due to the perhaps unsustainability of being a coach, given the demands placed upon them. So that's what we're hoping for, I think, from generating some of this research. And yeah, I think that's pretty much the end of my presentation today. I hope you guys got something out of it. I know there was a bit more focus on the coaches as well, but yeah, at this stage, the evidence base is quite thin, and we're just trying to develop a lot more research to be able to understand these populations so that we can put supports in place to prioritize and give attention to coaches and medical professionals.
Super. Thank you very much, Josh. That was fantastic.
My pleasure.
A real nice base of all the research you're doing and your team are doing and what's out there, and then kind of looking at approaches to support the coaches and the entourage. Now, what I might do is get you to stop sharing your screen there for a sec. And we've had some questions come in, so I'll just pass them over to you if that's okay. So thank you for these questions. The first one is, As there is more interest in the dual career approach for helping athletes, be it like, sport, study, employment, has there been any research done on dual career with coaches? It just feels like most of the time you hear about coaches, they're always working long hours, high stress, stretched thin. So is there much done on dual careers with coaches?
Not really from my knowledge. I think that's a really interesting point to be made. And it comes to the kind of point of the diversity of coaches too. We think about professional coaches who, their day-to-day environment is, in these high performance environments and things like that. But when you look at maybe some of the Olympic or Paralympic sports or games there, coaches might be on a volunteering base, or they might be paid very lowly. So they have to work these full-time jobs. So the difference between, an individual who works full-time as a coach compared to someone who's a volunteer has a very different experience as a coach, and might have different kind of stress and demands that might contribute or might make them susceptible towards experiences of mental ill health. So I've spoken to coaches before who are either volunteers or part-time, and they've talked about the challenges of having to juggle, a full-time job and then have to be passionate and, motivate all these sorts of athletes who might not even be paid as well, compared to someone who's obviously a full-time coach. If we think about their levels of responsibilities or their sorts of demands might be, a board or hierarchy expecting them to achieve certain performance outcomes and having to hit those targets. So I would say that I haven't seen much research about that kind of dual career approach, but I know there is that kind of interesting thing in being a coach, in your level of commitment or the level of remuneration that you get, and how that might contribute towards your ability to dedicate yourself to your profession or to the role as a coach, and then the subsequent impacts on your mental health outcomes.
Very good. And did you notice any gender difference factors in the research on coaches' mental health and their behaviours?
Say that again, sorry.
Did you notice any gender difference factors in the research on coaches' mental health and their behaviours?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, the majority of research is focused on males and men. So I think it was around, from when conducting my scoping review, I was able to collate all I was able to accumulate the number of participants made there. And I think the research in total focused on 79% on males and men, compared to 21% or whatever it was on females and women and things like that. So we weren't, I think there was some research suggesting that females or women might be more susceptible to mental health, or I can't remember the specific condition or disorder or type of presentation. But there is definitely this thing that sometimes women can feel, or females who operate within high performance environments, of having to make themselves known within hypermasculine environments, having to deal and kind of accommodate sort of the challenges presented to them of having to prove themselves to male coaches. I've heard, when I've spoken to coaches before, they've talked about not only, the kind of potentially even sexist nature of some of the high performance environments that they kind of been involved within, but just having to accept it because it's easier for their mental health, rather than challenging the structural sorts of factors put in place, given that these high performance environments, and especially coaching, can be often dominated by males and men. So I think there needs to be a lot more research in this sort of area, looking at gender-based differences. But given that I suppose most males, the majority of coaches tend to be males or men as well, it can be a little bit trickier in being able to investigate those components.
Very good. And if anyone else has any questions, you can pop them in. I have another one here. You did mention other identities. Could you expand on what's out there for coaches?
Yeah, I think when talking about identities, it's a lot to do with, not having your whole identity focused around being a high performance coach. Often, it's a very, depending what sport you're in, for example, it can be a very all-consuming profession or role. And when I was talking about identities, it was looking at other ways of, maybe you're having a day off on the Sunday or whatever, and making sure that you spend time with your family, making sure that you feel like you're a dad or a mother, or that you feel like you're a son or a family member, or you might be a golfer, or whatever it might be, is something like that. So that your whole life is not, you don't perceive yourself through that lens of, I am just a coach, my performance outcomes or results dictate the way that I feel, the way that I'm influenced, those sorts of things. So identities and cultivating those external identities are quite an important protective factor in supporting the mental health of these sorts of communities. So yeah, I think that's a really important thing that I talk to a lot about. I talk to coaches a lot about what sort of things do you do outside of coaching? Is this all consuming? Is just this everything part of your life? How do you feel after a poor result? Is your identity revolving entirely around being a coach, or do you feel it's something that you can step away from if you feel the need to, and go be with your family, go be a dad, a mum, or some other form of identity?
Very good. And now I'm actually asking a question probably away from the mental health, which you'll kill me, but I would just, if you've come across anything, I suppose in the high performance environment, the huge stressors, and we also often hear of maybe a lot of physical health issues in terms of like illnesses, being sick all the time. Have you come across much in the literature that about the high stress environments and maybe high levels of poor physical health or illness amongst coaches and support staff?
And often I suppose there's an overlap between that kind of mental health and physical health thing. There's a lot of coaches who talk about burnout and what does that feel like, exhaustion, how does that influence things such as sleep, for example? That is something that kind of touches upon things. I haven't come across, I suppose, specific things looking at the relationship between a coach and their kind of physical health. I know that it's really depending, once again, it depends what type of coach you are. Are you a head coach? Are you assistant and development coach? It can be very challenging to fit or schedule in physical activity or engage with regular exercise because of the demands of the schedule. So often during competitions, it can be really hard to make sure that you're looking after your physical well-being. It can be really hard to kind of prioritize that because the workload is so intense at those sorts of stages. So that often is something that might be neglected if coaches feel like they just don't have the time. So that probably has considerable impacts and influences upon the physical health of coaches and support staff, if that tends to be the case.
Yeah. Another question's just come in. So younger age was mentioned as a factor related to mental health. So what are your thoughts on the mental health of student support staff, i.e. assistant athletic trainer, assistant coach, data analyst?
Yeah, I mean, it's like everything, isn't it? So they're kind of juggling. Often you find that, like I said, with coaches or support staff, that they're, if you're in that kind of volunteering sort of part-time sort of role where you don't get the same sort of remuneration, where you might be even studying or you might be kind of working at the same time, it can be really challenging to kind of deal with all those kind of life stresses and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that's an interesting one to touch upon there. Coming back to that kind of younger age, yeah, I think sometimes it can be a protective factor and sometimes it can actually be a risk factor too. I think, that kind of protective factor in the sense of, there's more energy made available. There's, you might not feel that sense of burnout from having to do it. This might be the 10th year that you've been doing it, or the 15th year, and the exhaustion of having to go through the ringer of, having to achieve those performance outcomes or those expectations. Whereas on the flip side, those who might be younger might be more likely to, I suppose, work harder to prove themselves, to show the head coaches or to show other support staff members that they feel like they're worthy to be in their position, or that they want to climb up the ranking, or that they're motivated to be involved with that, which might lead to, I suppose, longer working hours, poorer work-life balance, which might create susceptibilities or vulnerabilities to mental health or burnout or stress or whatever it might be. So there's that kind of risk and protective factor with younger age. It's the same with kind of being older as well. You might be perhaps more experienced in understanding, I'm feeling a bit burnt out, or I'm feeling a bit under the weather, or whatever it might be. So I'm going to take some time off or prioritize my psychological, physiological recovery. So yeah, there's an interesting kind of balance there.
Yeah, very good. Another question: in speaking with coaches, what is the most common thing they say would support their work?
In terms of like protecting their mental health?
Yeah.
Okay. That's a good question. And once again, it's different for all sorts of people, different coaches and stuff like that. I think support network is one of the big things that people talk about. Having a robust family and friends to lean on if things are challenging, having people around them that are willing to make, I suppose, the sacrifices of being, the other person in a relationship, for example, or in a family, that allows the coach or the individual to kind of pursue their profession, things like that. Having opportunities to speak with friends, having been able to have mentors, having coaches that you can speak about some of these things with, or being like, having good relationships with people that makes you feel like you can be vulnerable, or you can talk about some of the challenges that you're going through, or if you're having a rough time or feeling more susceptible to some of the challenges associated with profession. I think that support network and that interpersonal relationships that we have with people are so key. And that's why when you're socially isolated, traveling a lot, having those long working hours, it can really feel, often coaches talk about, it's a little bit more suffocating, or you don't feel as more resilient because you don't have those structures around you that you feel like you can bounce ideas off, or perhaps, talk about some of the challenges that you're going through. So I would say that support networks are a really fundamental and crucial thing that's coaches speak about with regarding to protecting their mental health.
Yeah. I'll come in with one final question. And it's an interesting one because we often hear of sports psychologists and athletes, but how do coaches perceive getting support from sports psychologists? And are sports psychologists embedded enough in that ecosystem that you were talking about?
Really good question. And that's, I suppose, where my third study is starting to look at a little bit, those help-seeking pathways. How do coaches perceive help-seeking? Do they feel stigma? What are the things that are most important? What are the most important barriers? What are the most feasible things that ecosystems can be addressed? Now, I think that the important thing to caveat is, the Australian system is probably different to the UK, or probably different to the Irish system or the North American system and stuff like that. So different sort of organizations, different countries, different sporting bodies are going to have different levels of support, which are made available. I think one of the big things that there's a number of different things, and at this stage of the research, I couldn't tell you which one's probably the most important, but stigma, obviously, towards help seeking is a big one. Do coaches feel like they can access them? Sometimes even financial remuneration, like, is this something I should prioritize my money with, for example? Time, is there time to actually go seek a sports psychologist? And does the sports psychologist have enough time to talk to them if they're just talking to the athletes the whole time? Or that's the thing that's their priority. So coaches can often put it on the back burner and be like, perhaps this is not the most important thing for me at this stage. Perhaps I'm going to focus on something else, or put it on the back burner. So there's lots of different things, and hopefully my research will get to, share a bit of insights associated with help-seeking pathways, or getting the mental health supports and services that we need to be able to protect or to intervene early, I suppose, for the mental health of elite coaches.
Very good. Josh, I think we'll leave it there because I think we've worn you out with all those questions and discussions after. I'd just like to thank you very much for your presentation and doing it so late for us over there in Australia as well, and sharing your insights there with the questions. And thank you everybody for attending ISESA's webinar today, and for giving us in some questions as well. So if you'd like to subscribe, go to www.isesa.ie and you can subscribe there, and we'll keep you in the loop of all the information that between our podcasts, our blogs, our webinars, and all the other bits and pieces. And if you have any suggestions of webinars you'd like to hear on, or podcasts, or send a blog, get in touch, and we're here to support, I suppose, the Sport Next by Sciences community. So, give us some information that you want, and we can help there. So thank you very much, everybody. And Josh, thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for the attendance. Cheers, Orygen.